I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 13 of my series on the JFK assassination. In November 1966, 3 years after the assassination of President Kennedy, the U.S. Justice Department organizes a meeting at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The meeting consists of 4 people. 2 of the military pathologists who had conducted the autopsy on President Kennedy's body some 3 years before, Commanders Humes and Boswell, the radiologist at the autopsy, Captain John Ebersole, and the official photographer for the autopsy, John Stringer. At this meeting, a lawyer for the Justice Department presented these 4 individuals with a detailed written inventory of the photographs and x-rays that purportedly were in the official record of the autopsy. The purpose of the meeting was to have these 4 individuals actually examine the photographs and x-rays in the official record and compare them to the inventory to determine whether the inventory was true and correct. At the bottom of this written inventory, the Justice Department had inserted an affirmation that stated words to the effect that we hereby certify that this is a true, accurate, and complete inventory of the photographs and x-rays in the official autopsy record, and we have no reason to believe that there are any photographs or x-rays missing. So these 4 individuals proceed to do this examination, and in the process of doing so, Stringer, the photographer, says, "No, this isn't correct. Some of my photographs that I took during the autopsy are not in the inventory, and they're not in the official collection." And Commander Humes, one of the military pathologists, agreed with him. At the end of this process, all 4 of them signed the affirmation without any conditions, reservations, or qualifications, stating falsely that this was a true and accurate and correct and complete inventory, and that they had no reason to believe that anything was missing. It was a lie. Now, some 30 years later, Stringer was summoned to testify before the Assassination Records Review Board. And he acknowledged that he had knowingly and deliberately signed this false affirmation. All 4 of them had. And the general counsel for the ARRB, a lawyer named Jeremy Gunn, obviously referring to the military, said to Stringer, "You know, there are people who object to these sorts of things." And Stringer's response was very revealing. Stringer said, "Well, yeah, that's true, but they don't go very far either." Now, over the years and decades since the assassination, those who defend the official version of the assassination have expressed a common lament with respect to the autopsy. Their lament goes like this: "Oh, if only the military had appointed competent pathologists to perform this autopsy, there wouldn't be so many mistakes. There wouldn't be this controversy surrounding the autopsy. Oh, if only they had appointed these competent pathologists, everything would have come out fine." Let's get something clear about the autopsy of President John F. Kennedy that was conducted by the military. We are not talking about mistakes here. A mistake is when you fail to fill out some form or forget to perform some laboratory test. What we're dealing with in this autopsy is intentional malfeasance, intentional misconduct, like a false affirmation on an official federal document relating to an official federal proceeding, to wit, the autopsy of a president of the United States. Or when we're talking about them sneaking the body in early at 6:35 p.m. for the purpose of conducting pre-autopsy surgery, or really what amounts to intentional desecration of a body, that's intentional malfeasance. That's a federal criminal offense, just like the false affirmation is. Or when we're talking about 2 sets of photographs, one which correctly depict the condition on the back of President Kennedy's head, as per the testimony of Sandra Spencer, who we've discussed in previous episodes, and then another set that falsely depicts the condition of the back of President Kennedy's head. That's falsity. That's deception. That's fraud. That's cover-up. Or when we have two separate photographers, one the official one, and then one the secret one, Robert Knudsen, who we discussed in a previous episode. That's deception. Or when we have two separate brain examinations that are being sold as one brain examination, that's deception. That's fraud. That's what we're dealing with in the Kennedy autopsy, not mistakes or accidents. Now, about a month, little over a month after this November 66 meeting, in January of 67, the Justice Department calls a second meeting at the National Archives. This meeting consists of the three military pathologists who conducted the autopsy, Commanders Humes and Boswell, and Army Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink. Now, the reason that Fink was not at the first meeting was that he was serving in Vietnam. You'll recall that after Johnson was elevated to the presidency on the death of President Kennedy, he and the military concocted a false story, a lie, regarding a supposed attack by North Vietnamese gunships on American warships who just happened to be coincidentally patrolling near North Vietnamese waters. They used this false story to get a congressional resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, not a congressional declaration of war, as the Constitution requires before the military and the president can wage war, simply a resolution that they used to justify a massive combat military invasion of Vietnam, along with what would become years of bombing attacks on North Vietnam. So Fink was over there in November of 66 as part of this military operation. But they bring him all the way back from Vietnam for the purpose of this meeting. Now, the aim of this meeting was to have the three military pathologists review the photographs and the x-rays in the official record to determine whether they felt they supported their original autopsy findings 3 years before. Now, never mind that it was an incomplete inventory, and never mind that there's bogus photographs in there. That was their job, to determine whether they could certify their own findings. And it might not surprise you to know that they concluded that, yes, the photographs and the x-rays really did support their autopsy report back in 63, which, of course, included the supposed bullet entry wound at the base of President Kennedy's hairline. Now, a year later, a little bit more than a year later, in early March of 1968, the Justice Department calls a third meeting at the National Archives. Sort of. Well, the reason I say sort of is because actually Commander Boswell, one of the three military pathologists who conducted the autopsy, he sends a letter to the Justice Department requesting the Justice Department to call into existence a panel consisting of renowned pathologists, independent pathologists, whose job it would be to review the autopsy photographs and the x-rays and determine whether they could put their seal of approval on the autopsy that the military pathologists had conducted back in 63. Well, when Boswell, so it appears that Boswell is the one making this request, not the Justice Department. But 30 years later, Boswell's testifying before the Assassination Records Review Board. And he tells the board that what actually happened was that the Justice Department asked him to write this letter. Apparently, the Justice Department did not want to be seen as the entity that was calling for this panel. In other words, more deception. Well, this panel comes into existence. It consists of a few renowned pathologists, and their job is to review the photographs and the x-rays. And it came to be known by the name the Clark Panel, named after Ramsey Clark, who was the Attorney General and who had been appointed Attorney General by Lyndon Johnson. Clark was a native Texan, a lawyer from Texas, close confidant, trusted ally of Lyndon Johnson. So the Clark Panel reviews the photographs and x-rays, and they decide that they're going to put their stamp of approval on the autopsy report that had been issued by the military pathologist back in '63, with one exception. They said that that bullet wound that they had seen during the autopsy, or supposedly seen there at the base of President Kennedy's hairline, needed to be moved up 4 inches. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it is. Because in a previous episode, we discussed how the House Select Committee panel of pathologists in the mid-1970s, 7 or 8 years after the Clark panel, determined that they were going to put their seal of approval on the autopsy report with that one exception, that they needed to move the wound up 4 inches, even though neither the Clark panel nor the House Select Committee panel was at the autopsy. They were judging this based on a little red spot that they saw in the photographs. But the finding made it more palatable to then have supposedly caused this massive damage on the right side of President Kennedy's head. Because remember, we discussed with the House Select Committee panel that if you have a gunshot coming down at the base of the hairline from the 6th floor of a building, which is what the official version said, it would be virtually impossible to cause this massive damage up here. And keep in mind also that the Dallas physicians said, well, that was all nonsense because the right side of Kennedy's head was perfectly intact. So it was the Clark panel that actually saw the need to move the wound up 4 inches. And so it was the House Select Committee that was essentially saying, we agree with the Clark panel. Now, the question obviously arises, why these 3 meetings? What's the purpose of these 3 meetings? Why do you need this inventory 3 years after the autopsy report? Why do you need this reaffirmation by the military pathologists that everything they did was correct? Why do you need this independent panel saying, hey, what they did was correct? Well, one possibility, and people have speculated, that by this time there were lots of attacks taking place on the assassination and to a certain extent the autopsy. Now keep in mind that the shenanigans that we've examined in this series on the autopsy, nobody knew about these. There were like little strange anomalies or inconsistencies. But remember, the military had put a cloak of secrecy, national security, classified information on the autopsy that pretty much, with a few exceptions during the House Select Committee hearings, had stood their ground, had worked all the way up to the ARRB. But remember, the ARRB was prohibited from investigating anything that they found that had been kept secret for some 60 years. But in '66, people are starting to raise questions, and they're causing a lot of unease across the country among many Americans. One of these, for example, was a lawyer from New York named Mark Lane, who was traveling around the country giving lectures saying there's a lot of things wrong with this assassination official version. He published a book in '66 that became a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list in '66, the year where this first meeting is being held, and it was called Rush to Judgment. There was another guy named Harold Weisberg that was publishing books that raised questions about the assassination and, to a minor extent, the anomalies that appeared in the autopsy. The international press was raising questions. Some people were suggesting that this was a national security state operation. Some people were even suggesting that Johnson was a part of the assassination. And then consider this. In February of '67, now this is 1 month after the second meeting, the district attorney of New Orleans, Jim Garrison, brings a criminal prosecution, or at least announces that he's investigating what he says is effectively a highly sophisticated, highly complex national security state regime change operation and cover-up. So you have all these people raising these questions and a lot of unease across the land. So people have speculated, well, maybe the Justice Department was using these 3 meetings to buttress the official version, with the inventory checking and the recertification and the Clark panel. And that might make some sense, except for one thing. The Clark panel is kept secret. It's kept secret for more than a year. And the other 2 meetings are pretty much secret too. I mean, they're confidential. They're not, in other words, they're not being used to trumpet or buttress the official version. Why not? I mean, if that's the purpose of these 3 meetings, you would think, boy, they'd be saying, hey, look, we've got a panel of independent pathologists, renowned, who have put their seal of approval on this autopsy. Why do they keep it secret? I suggest that there's a better explanation for what was going on with these 3 meetings. And that explanation revolves around the man who replaced John Kennedy as president upon his death. That man was Lyndon Baines Johnson.